Hello, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Hello, hello. So we're just going to give it another few minutes to let people join, and Bob will be with us in just a second here. There he is.
Okay, now can you hear me?
I can hear you great.
Okay, perfect. Whew. I know.
Yeah.
I was sitting there. I was like, where is he?
So we've got a handful of people on already.
Okay.
So we can get started. I'm sure more will trickle in here.
Yeah. Do you want me to share my screen yet, or do you want me to wait until we go through our first part?
Yeah, let's wait until we go into the session, into your content.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah, we can start with some other things first. So
okay.
Yeah, so let's get going.
Okay.
First of all, hi everyone. It's really good to see those of you that are here. And we've got a really awesome session today. And as you can see, I'm joined by Bob Seebohar, and today's topic is metabolic efficiency training and nutrition periodization. And this is part 2 of a 2-part webinar series. And so part 1 has also been recorded, and you can watch that at any time. We're going to record this one as well and share it after we're done here. My name is Rowie, and I am the Director of Business Development at Inside Tracker. And today you're here because you're going to learn from Bob. So I'm going to start by introducing him. Buckle up because it's quite the resume here. So Bob is a board certified specialist in sports dietetics, and he's the former director of sports nutrition for the University of Florida, and served as a sports dietitian for the U.S. Olympic Committee. Bob actually traveled to the 2008 Summer Olympic Games as a sports dietitian for the U.S. Olympic team, and is the personal sports dietitian and exercise physiologist for the Olympic triathlon team. Currently, Bob owns his own practice called eNRG Performance, and he is the consulting sports dietitian for the University of Denver Athletic Department. He's got a bachelor's degree in exercise and sports science, a master's degree in health and exercise science, and then a second master's degree in food science and human nutrition. He is a registered dietitian, exercise physiologist, NSCA certified strength and conditioning specialist, and a high performance endurance coach. So hopefully that gives you a good idea for why I'm so excited to be here again with Bob for the second time. Bob is also an Inside Tracker Pro, which is one of the programs that we have at Inside Tracker, and he actually has written several books as well, including on the topics of today's webinar, metabolic efficiency training and nutrition periodization. So like I said, today is a really great chance for you all to learn from Bob, hear more about these topics. And our objective with these webinars really is to give you all an opportunity to learn from other professionals in your industry. So they're really designed to help you. So to start, I'm going to do a brief introduction on Inside Tracker. Then we're going to spend a few minutes on Q&A with Bob so that you all can get to know him a little bit better. And then Bob is going to jump into his material about metabolic efficiency training and nutrition periodization. Time permitting, we will also try to do a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat, and then we will do our best to address them at the end of the session. And then again, quick reminder, this is recorded, so we're going to share the recording once it's done. So let's dive into a overview of Inside Tracker. And for that, I'm going to share my screen. We'll go through a quick slide deck. And I'll make it full screen. Okay, so many of you are familiar with Inside Tracker, so this might be a little bit of a repeat for those that are not. Great. Hopefully this will be a good chance for you to learn about us. So Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition and performance system. Now, I want to start from the beginning, which is really how and why and when Inside Tracker was founded. So we were founded in 2009, and we were founded by Dr. Gil Blander. And Gil founded Inside Tracker after spending the first portion of his career as an aging researcher. And Gil decided at the age of 12, after losing his aunt, that he wanted to devote his life to helping people live longer, better lives. And after years of research as a postdoc at one of the best aging research labs in the world, the Lenny Guarente lab here at MIT. So we're headquartered in Boston, Cambridge. So Gil was at MIT. Gil decided to found Inside Tracker in 2009 to fulfill this mission to help people everywhere add years to their life and life to their years. And Inside Tracker was really founded on 4 principles. So the first is that if you want to help someone live a longer, healthier life, it has to start with personalization, because we're all different. And in order to be personalized, Gil believed that you have to start inside, the same way that you pop the hood open on your car so your mechanic can fix what's broken and your car can run smoothly. Gil decided that Inside Tracker's philosophy is going to be, there's no reason why you can't do that for your body, the most precious and complex machine that we have. And this is why the first step of doing Inside Tracker is a blood analysis. It's really our version of popping the hood open on your body to get an accurate picture of what's happening inside, and then understanding where you have areas for improvement. The second principle is that we all want to be optimal, right? And achieve peak performance, feel and perform our best, whatever performance means to us. And so that requires you going a step further than just settling for normal. And so if you think about how that manifests itself for, let's say, a runner, which I know a lot of you work with runners, think about a marker like ferritin, which is a marker of iron storage. And if you've ever had your ferritin tested through a traditional blood test, let's say you went to a physician and you got those results back, you probably saw that there's a normal range for every marker. Ferritin is no exception. And if you think about the normal range for a woman for ferritin, that's typically between 12 and about 150 nanograms per milliliter, which we know is a very broad range. Now, we also know that a runner, especially a female runner, and even more so if they're premenopausal, has higher iron needs than the average person. And so in Inside Tracker's opinion, that ferritin level should be personalized if that person is a runner, if they are a woman, if they are a specific age. And so it creates an optimal range for every single biomarker. And then if they're outside of that optimal range, it's going to give recommendations on how to optimize it. The third principle Inside Tracker was founded on is really to use science to cut through all the BS that's out there. And there's a lot of it around fitness, nutrition, health, performance. And so every single recommendation that Inside Tracker generates is backed by at least one study. On average, there's 3 studies that support it. And then the fourth principle is to be holistic. So Inside Tracker is looking at blood, but also DNA, fitness trackers, so things like sleep, heart rate, and activity, age, gender, ethnicity, height, weight, habits, and goals. And by combining this diverse set of data about an individual, the algorithm can deliver personalized insights and recommendations. So I just said a lot of words, but at a high level, Insight Tracker is doing two main things. One is it's giving someone a really clear and holistic picture of what's happening inside. And then two, it's providing nutrition and lifestyle recommendations that are backed by peer-reviewed evidence and based on a combination of an individual's blood, DNA, and data coming from a fitness tracker. Now, many of you are professionals, coaches, trainers, dietitians, working with clients or athletes. And so we do have a program called Insight Tracker Pro that we launched this year. That's the program that actually Bob is a part of. And I want to mention that to you. It was really designed for a coach, a trainer, a dietitian, other practitioner to make Insight Tracker a tool that they could have in their toolbox to better serve their clients. And the way the program works is you get a discount on Insight Tracker for yourself. You can offer your clients a discount on Insight Tracker. You receive a revenue share, so it's an opportunity to earn additional income for you as a professional. You get access to your clients' results and recommendations through a secure online portal, so you can incorporate the data in the training prescriptions. And if you're a nutrition professional, in the nutrition prescriptions that you're providing. And then we arm you with tons of education like today's webinar. So that should be a pretty good overview of Insight Tracker. And with that, I would love to spend a few minutes on a brief Q&A with you, Bob, again, so that people can get to know you a little bit better before we dive into the main event here.
Absolutely.
So the first question I have for you is, so you've been a partner of ours and an Insight Tracker Pro for a few months now. So my question is, why did you decide to make Insight Tracker a component of your practice and of your service?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I get asked that quite a bit. So I've been doing what I do for 25 plus years now. And back in the days, I love saying that, back in the days, dietitians we usually just refer to physicians for blood work, right? This is what was happening 20 years ago. And it was very basic blood work, CBC, like you're lucky if you got iron panels. We weren't looking at vitamin D back then, like none of these great markers we know that endurance athletes really are accustomed to. It started changing a little bit, but not too much. Like in the past 5 to 10 years, I personally made this shift into seeking out, opportunities to try to get better blood work testing for my athletes so I could monitor them. And that's really the name of the game as a dietitian, as a coach. You want to monitor your athlete as well as you can throughout their lifespan and kind of help with their continuum of care. So I've been utilizing blood work analysis in my practice for 25 plus years. It's not until, and I had a system that was working for me. But what lacked before I came over to Insight Tracker was the monitoring piece. So I've also been coaching athletes, endurance athletes for 25 years, right? The biggest thing that I do as a coach is monitor. And I always tell athletes and coaches on the webinar, I'm sure you'll agree, it's pretty easy to develop a training program for an athlete. The hard part is monitoring them, monitoring their progress, their sleep, their nutrition, their biomarkers. In the previous platform I'd used before, it wasn't actually even a platform. It was literally a get tested. They did an okay job at looking at the data, which is great, but I couldn't monitor my athletes. Like I had to search for these PDFs. They were scanning it, emailing it to me, taking photos of it. I wasn't really happy with the monitoring piece of that until I came to you guys, right? Insight Tracker literally has opened my mind into how I can actually monitor my athletes, help them take control of their health. And I love those 4 guiding principles. I've actually never seen those before. So those resonated with me because really what was lacking in my previous blood work analysis and provider was that holistic approach, right? So yes, we get the analysis, we get some data-based, science-based, but it's really that bringing it all together in one package. And that's what I love about Insight Tracker, both as a dietitian, as a coach. Like the athlete, it empowers the athlete to kind of take an active role in their health instead of the age old, I go to the doctor, I see what him or her gives me in terms of a data interpretation based on blood work. Maybe they recommend some things, maybe they don't. It's left there, right? And then years and years and years pass, and there's no tracking, there's no monitoring, right? So that's why I made the move over, because I'm super excited to actually be able to monitor my athletes. I actually just got off a phone call earlier with one of my athletes. She had an ultimate test 4 months ago, and then ultimate literally last week. So we got to compare apples to apples, and it's just so powerful because I was able to provide her different nutrition prescriptions before, like when she got her first test. And now we got to look at that and we said, okay, managing the next few months, what are our nutrition goals now? And what are your exercise training goals now based on your updated blood work? So it's been a total game changer for myself as a health professional, but also just in practice.
Tested with Inside Tracker a few times yourself now. So what have you learned from your own experience?
Yeah, so I've been, sticking needles in me, so to speak. I'm not a phlebotomist, but I am my own guinea pig. So I've been doing self experiments for 20 years at least. This recent one, it's interesting because I followed a specific dietary regimen that I gave myself earlier this year. And I'm not going to let too much of the cat out of the bag because I actually would love to do another webinar kind of picking these pieces together. But so I followed kind of a controlled carbohydrate experiment, if you will. And this was earlier this year. So controlling carbohydrates, making sure protein and fat were not a major source, but definitely more of a concerted effort in my daily nutrition plan. Had my first ultimate test in May. Then I completely did a 180. And I shifted into pretty heavy carbohydrate intake. Now, and I'm not talking junk and sugar foods, but fruits and vegetables and whole grains. A lot of the foods I wasn't eating in my first dietary experiment. And I just wanted to see what would happen, because what I haven't told everyone yet is I was not dealt really good cards in terms of blood lipids, right? So my family history, horrible genetic component of high cholesterol, high LDL, low HDL, like high triglycerides, the whole shebang, right? And it's just been part of me. Yeah, you feel it, right? But here's the thing. In the past, we used to just take that and say, okay, that's the card that was dealt to me, or those are the cards. I can't do anything about it. Well, no, we actually can. And this is what I love about the Inside Tracker, because we can monitor it. And what I've been able to do is experiment with two completely polar opposite nutrition plans to see what effect it had on my blood work. And like I said, I'm not going to give too much of the data yet, but I will tell you, when we talk about cholesterol, total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides, those are the main components that most doctors and physicians will speak about. Though almost, let's put it this way. If a doctor was interpreting my first test, he or she would have put me on statins, the drug statins, right? Mm-hmm. If they would have seen my second test and I told them I did not change my training, all I did was change nutrition, they would have, number one, probably not believed me. And number two, after I would get them to believe me, they would say, wow, that's fantastic. Your cholesterol is lower, because my cholesterol came down significantly. My LDL came down significantly. But here's the thing. As you recall, we dug deeper and we did a little bit more of a comprehensive blood lipid profile. That allowed me to look at the particle size of LDL, HDL, kind of looking at more cardiovascular risk factors, if you will, kind of the not really the bigger picture, but really popping the hood, right? I saw some opposite effects. So even though my cholesterol went down, some of the particle size, the alarming particle size factors, actually went up. So that's until I really showed the data, you're not going to really understand that too much. But normal speaking, my cholesterol went down. My doctor would say, Bob, you're good. I'll see you in a year. When in fact, if I dig a little bit deeper, even though my cholesterol went down, some of my bad markers actually went up. And that's what's interesting. And that's what we see in the research. And I think I'd love to do another webinar on looking at LDL-C, which is LDL cholesterol, and then LDL-P, which is LDL particle size. And that's what needs to be really differentiated these days. And I will tell you, mine was night and day. I mean, I was celebrating when I first saw my cholesterol and LDL go down. And then I looked down the list on the blood work and I was like, oh, but maybe that's not a good thing. So I'll just leave it at that. Like, I get super excited, not so much because now I need to craft another dietary experiment, obviously, but I got super excited because we get to peek, kind of pop that hood, I got to peek into my body to see really which dietary strategy is best for me. And here's the thing, when it comes to blood lipids, as everybody knows, like, we're talking cardiovascular disease, right? That can lead to death. we're not talking about low iron stores or low vitamin D. Like this can be life or death. So if someone isn't monitoring this, they're kind of rolling the dice in terms of the genetic cards and the genetic makeup.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that value of being able to do baseline follow-up and do kind of an N1 experiment and try some new things and see the result with objective hard evidence is one that I think is really invaluable.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I know that a lot of the research is emerging around the blood lipids and particle size. And so that's a really interesting topic, probably for a future discussion
Absolutely.
on that.
Yeah.
Now, you're also using Insight Tracker with your athletes.
I am. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, how's that experience been for you, and how do you use it with your athletes?
Well, I'll tell you, because in the past it was, like I said, the athlete would go to their physician, pretty much get a CBC, have to, really, kind of coerce them into maybe getting iron, maybe getting vitamin D, those kind of markers. And then they give it to me. And I get that like once every 2 years, like literally once every 2 years. I mean, what do you do with that? Right. I mean, you can't, blood work should be done at least twice a year, especially with trained athletes. Right. Mm-hmm. So what I've been doing is trying to have this 4 to 6 month protocol where an athlete gets their pre-ultimate test. And then we do some considerations in terms of dietary changes, exercise changes. Then we have another ultimate test 4 to 6 months later. I'm starting to get the results back in from some of my earlier athletes. Night and day. Like, talk about empowering them. Oh my gosh. Like I said, I just got off the phone with one of my athletes a couple hours ago. She had the ultimate pre and post, May and October, and her in all three, like the markers. So she's a triathlete. She's an Ironman athlete. So kind of one of the crazy endurance athletes. Her markers I look specifically at vitamin D, iron, and B12, because not that she's vegan or vegetarian, but she was super low in B12 early on. She wasn't eating a lot of animal proteins. I implemented a little bit more of a metabolic efficiency plan, which we're going to learn about today, right? And to try to adjust some of her low markers. So she had low iron, she had like really low vitamin D and pretty low B12, which I usually don't see unless they are a vegan athlete. And she sent me her results earlier, and she was like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I was talking to her today. She could not stop talking about it because she's like, hey, it worked. And, the back of my mind, I'm like, of course it worked, right? You never know how much it's going to work. So here's the takeaway from this. Her vitamin D increased, her vitamin B12 increased, and her iron stores, all markers of iron stores actually increased. Huge success. She supplemented with all three of those. So my discussion with her, because we crafted a different nutrition plan, we gave her some supplementation. Now moving forward, because she's still in off season. And as you guys all learned, if you watched my first part, we have to periodize an athlete's nutrition based on their training cycles, based on their season. She's still in off season. So she doesn't have a lot of volume, doesn't have a lot of intensity. So what we talked about is we're going to maintain her nutrition the same, but I was excited about her B12. Her iron came up, but we still had a little ways to go. Her vitamin D came up, but we still had a long way to go with that. So what that's allowing me to do is obviously look at a little bit of food differences, but being a little bit more aggressive in supplementation for her, because we started on a low end and we found out what that low end supplementation and a different dietary shift does. Now I need to be more aggressive with her with supplementation, keeping the diet the same, because we know where we want to get her before she starts Ironman training. Because if we don't get her to a certain level before Ironman, all these levels are going to go back down again.
Right. Sure. Yeah. And again, the value of tracking over time, I think I'm hearing it.
Tremendous. Tremendous. Yeah.
Well, I have one more question for you before we dive into the main event here. And so a lot of the people here that are listening are coaches, not necessarily dietitians, medical practitioners.
Right.
And we know that they can benefit from this. How would you, as a registered dietitian, recommend that a coach uses this while still staying within their scope of practice?
Absolutely. Yeah. So back in the day, I mentor a lot of coaches and a lot of dietitians, but to the coach's perspective, there is a scope of practice that we need to definitely watch, and we don't want to step over that, because then we get into legal concerns, right? So in the past, I used to kind of basically tell coaches, hey, you've got to get a dietitian or a physician on staff, on your kind of performance team, if you will, to help you with that. Here's why I love Inside Tracker, because Inside Tracker, from an athlete's perspective, like if they're low in, B12, it's going to flag that, but then it's going to list certain foods to increase B12, amount of servings per week they should eat. So it actually takes it off of the coach's plate in terms of scope of practice, because it's all in Inside Tracker on the athlete view. So the coaches don't need to prescribe, and you shouldn't prescribe nutrition or supplements, right? You should educate for sure. And everything we talk about today is definitely about education. But Inside Tracker allows you to maintain that professionalism without overstepping your boundaries.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's one thing I love about Inside Tracker. Literally, it just makes it so much easier.
Agreed. So Bob, thank you. I think that was really useful. Hopefully for those listening, it was useful to hear a little bit more about you, your experience with Inside Tracker and your athletes. So I'd love to turn it over to you now and for you to dive into metabolic efficiency training and nutrition periodization, and ready to learn.
Absolutely. I'm excited. All right. So let me share my screen really quick. I think you have to give me the ability to do that.
Okay, let's figure this out. Huh.
Gotcha.
I'll do that.
Yeah. There's got to be a button somewhere, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I will make you the host, and that should solve it.
Okay.
There you go.
Perfect. Oh, got it. Fantastic. Okay, let me know if you can see this okay.
We can, yes.
Is that good? Okay. So I'm going to try to be respectful of everyone who's listening to the time. We've got roughly 33 minutes. I'm not going to try to go fast and talk too fast, but there is a lot of information. I do want to leave maybe a few minutes for questions. So bear with me in terms of the first few slides, because it is kind of a review, and hopefully the expectation is either you listen to my first webinar live, or you listen to the recording. So welcome to part 2. Today we're really delving in more to I love what you said earlier, Roy, with the popping the hood, because that's the term I always use. So we're going to actually pop the hood, not from a blood work analysis standpoint, but from what's called a substrate oxidation standpoint. So I'll get into that here in 1 second. What about me? You learned about me. So what we're going to cover is looking at dietary implementation strategies. Actually, one super easy one that I've created that I use with every single athlete that you can also use, because it's purely educational. It's not really a prescription. There are no numbers, so you can't really get in trouble with it. Then I'm gonna launch into the actual testing protocol. So I devised this metabolic efficiency training concept about 16, 17 years ago now. With that, I also created the physiological protocol or testing protocol. So I'm going to share that with you. And then I'm going to show you some case studies, kind of where the rubber meets the road, in terms of, as you make dietary changes, daily nutrition changes, what kind of effects will that have on an athlete's ability to oxidize or burn fat and store more carbohydrates. So that's kind of where we're going. A little bit of background, just kind of a refresher. Metabolic efficiency training, as you see, is in the middle here. Kind of a bell-shaped curve if we look at it. On both ends of the continuum are your low carb, high fat, kind of keto diets. And on the other end is your high carb, low fat, super crazy carbohydrate diets, right? So metabolic efficiency is not a diet. It's actually just a periodized nutrition plan. And as you can see on the foundation, we really look at the periodization of training. So be it runners, be it triathletes, be it cyclists, doesn't matter, any type of endurance athlete, any athlete for that matter. Every athlete goes through different cycles. So metabolic efficiency training should be periodized throughout the year to support optimal blood sugar control. So I'll get to that here in just 1 second. This is where we're focusing, like the dotted green line. We want to focus on the middle. Like I said, it's not a diet. We're not trying to promote short-term behavior change. We're trying to promote long-term behavior change, try to get out of the diet handcuffs, out of the diet mentality. There's no diet. If you read my book, I don't think I ever mentioned diet. I actually hate saying that word. So I'm done saying that word now for the whole presentation. Okay, so a little bit of background with the whole metabolic efficiency training. Again, it's all about blood sugar optimization. So you can have two effects of blood sugar based on what type of food you eat or an athlete eats. You can have this huge roller coaster effect where your blood sugar goes up and down and up and down and up and down. Not a good thing, right? And I'll tell you why here in a second. We want to try to promote the happy blood sugar line, which is the red dotted line. That's the one where we're stabilizing energy. We feel good. We don't feel like we need a nap throughout the afternoon. We don't feel like we need caffeine or sugar at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, right? That's where we want to get to. But why? Like, who cares? Like, what if I don't regulate my blood sugar well? What if I spike it and I drop it and it just goes like that throughout the day? Well, you're not going to feel good, but there's actually a lot of science behind unregulated blood sugar, right? So what we see here is these are all scientifically backed. Unregulated blood sugar reduces mental and physical performance, decreases focus, concentration, increases hunger, decreases the feeling of fullness. So the athlete's always eating. It teaches the body to use more carbohydrate. So if you remember from my first webinar, our bodies have very limited stores of carbohydrates called glycogen. Usually we only have, roughly speaking, about 2 hours worth of carbohydrates, 2 hours worth of moderate intense exercise. So if you go for a 2-hour run, 2-hour bike ride, something like that, you're going to kind of tap out your carbohydrate stores. So the whole science of blood sugar regulation is to control it better with food, with carbohydrates, protein, and fat, to be able to teach the body to utilize more of its fat stores and preserve its carbohydrate stores. So why is that so important for endurance athletes? It doesn't matter if they're 5Kers or ultra marathoners. It is so important also from a health perspective, but I'll get to that in a second, right? From a performance perspective, if you've got almost an unlimited surplus of fat stores in your body, in fact, most of us are walking around with 60, 70, 80,000 calories worth of fat stored in our bodies. Sometimes you can't see it, sometimes you can, but we're only walking around with about 1,200 to 2,000 calories as carbohydrate. So in a running example, especially like marathon, maybe half marathon, but definitely marathon and above, we want to preserve as many carbohydrates as possible because that's the limiting factor. We always hear about hitting the wall, right? Bonking, hitting the wall. That's just because glycogen is so low that your blood sugar is dropping and you don't have that immediate fuel. But what if you could actually teach your body to preserve those carbohydrates until it's really needed? So at some intensity point of exercise, could be heart rate, could be pace, could be RPE, whatever it is. If it's a cyclist, could be power. At some intensity point, the body will start to shift and it will need more carbohydrate. The goal of metabolic efficiency training with daily nutrition changes is to prolong that point. So as an example, you'll see a lot of case studies I present, but maybe my metabolic efficiency point where my body crosses from fat burning to carbohydrate burning, maybe that's at an 8-minute pace, 8-minute per mile pace, right? Well, my goal is to try to get that maybe to a 740 pace, 730 pace, 720 pace, right? The faster we go and we can burn more fat, that means we can get faster, number one, using fat, but it also means we've got this huge carbohydrate tank to rely on. Last 10K of the marathon, last 20 miles of an ultra, right? That's what we really want to create here. So that's the performance side of it. Health-wise, we know that if blood sugar is not regulated, it leads to a whole host of problems. That could be metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes, inflammatory disorders, some arthritic disorders. So blood sugar is really at the whole core of this. So when it comes to this is, again, part two and more of the implementation, because I described everything and all the science behind it in part one. I really wanted to delve into the nutrition, the daily nutrition changes that you can help athletes make. And it's real life, right? Absolutely real life. So before I get into the next slide and I show you these, I want to make note that I am a sport dietitian who does not focus on calorie counting. So throughout the day, there's no calorie counting, there's no measuring, there's no weighing. If athletes want to track their food, that's fine. I get it. It's a great teaching opportunity, kind of keeps them accountable every so often. I have some athletes that I work with that do it, but they only do it for a couple of days a month, right? Just to kind of spark their memory and kind of make sure we're all on the same track. So I wanted to preface that because what you're going to see on the next slide is a very qualitative, simplistic model that I've developed from a very quantitative, research-backed data set, if you will. So quickly, I'll tell you, when I first got out of my dietetic internship, and this was eons ago, right? We are taught to feed like certain amount of calories and grams of carbs and protein and fat. And that's just what we're taught. Like we're taught to do that in a clinical setting, a hospital setting. I actually started to do that in real life when I got done, when I actually became a official registered dietitian. And I found within the first couple months of working with athletes, it didn't work because they didn't need numbers. They needed to talk about food. So that's when I kind of did a 180 and developed this very simplistic model. It's not perfect, right? And actually quantitative models are not perfect either, but this is better in terms of being able to educate athletes because it allows them to assimilate when they're hungry, when they're full, kind of teaches them a little bit more about what we call intuitive eating. So listening to your body instead of just feeding the machine, it's actually listening to your body. So with all that said and done, drum roll, please. Here it is. This is what I call the hand model. So remember what we're trying to do with metabolic efficiency training. We're trying to regulate and optimize blood sugar through the combination of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. I have looked at all the research, measuring things, like you name it, and I needed to find something simplistic. And what I found was that if we use our hands, there's a lot of research behind this, but it's not just like out of the blue, but we can actually use the size of the hand. So the entire hand, as you see on the graphic, the entire, wrist to fingertips, to assimilate somewhat of the volume of carbohydrate and protein that we should eat to maximize blood sugar control. So number one, why don't we see fat on here? Well, for non-vegans, non-vegetarian athletes, every time a non-vegan or vegetarian athlete eats protein, animal-based protein, they have fat in there. So we don't really pick on fat too much unless we see some deficiencies in fat. What we do is we just assume that the fat is coming from the protein sources, right? Now, in vegan vegetarian athletes, it's a little bit different. We can kind of discuss that a little bit later, maybe even do a whole, that could be another webinar, Roy, to be honest with you. That'd be awesome to do, right? Just for the plant-based athletes, because I work with quite a few. I'm here in Colorado, and as you can imagine, there are a few plant-based athletes in Colorado floating around. So that said, we really focus on this carbohydrate to protein ratio because in science, this ratio, actually, I adopted it from diabetes research and I made it more into an athletic model. But we know that this ratio of a 1 part carbohydrate or 1 hand of carbohydrate to 1 part or 1 hand protein, as you see on the far left, that is the ideal ratio for stabilizing and optimizing blood sugar. Absolutely ideal. We also know that 2 to 1. So if you double the carbs, so 2 hands of carbs to 1 hand of protein, that's still pretty good at blood sugar regulation. 3 to 1. So now we're getting a little bit out of the scope, but 3 to 1 is kind of okay, but you're probably not going to optimize blood sugar anymore. You're just going to kind of maybe stabilize it here and there. Once you get 4 to 1, there's not a lot of blood sugar control. It's basically so much carbohydrates that your blood sugar is going to go up pretty quickly. Now, if you go to the bottom of the slide and you see these little words here, this is where the periodization of the carbohydrate to protein ratio or hand model comes into play. So if we look back to this 1-to-1 hand model, which we know is optimal for controlling blood sugar, that should really only be done in a preparatory phase, in the transition phase, which is also called off-season, or if an athlete is seeking weight loss or body fat loss. That is the only time that should be implemented, and it should be implemented with care, because here's the thing. Number one, it's not going to give them a lot of carbohydrates to perform well. Not a good thing to do a 1-to-1 in mid-season or intensity or build or interval sets, right? Not a good thing to do. Number two, it's extremely difficult to do a 1-to-1 ratio because you have to, most endurance athletes eat so many carbohydrates. For them to come down to only 1 handful per meal, that's pretty tough for them to do. So from a behavior standpoint, that is a very difficult one. I save it for early prep season, early base, or off season, or like I said, for a weight loss phase. Most of the time, I start athletes with the 2-to-1 because it's much more realistic. It's pretty easy to do for the most part, and it can be done year round. As you see down below, it can be done during base training, competition phase, and also transition. So most of the times throughout the year, I will actually toggle between the 1-to-1 to 2-to-1, depending on the athlete's health goals, their biomarker, their blood marker status, which obviously they hopefully got through Inside Tracker, so we can kind of see some of those biomarkers. And then also looking at the off season, right? And their health goals, and because we can't forget about health, and that's where the biomarker testing comes into play. So I like to mostly focus on the green, although I do tap into that 3-to-1 ratio when I know there's like bigger workouts. Like as an example, if this athlete I was talking about earlier, if she's starting her Ironman training, maybe not starting, but maybe she's mid-season and she's starting to do 3-hour bike rides, maybe 2-hour runs, like those are a little bit more stressful energetically from a metabolic standpoint. So I may have to make sure that she has enough carbohydrates in her body to satisfy maybe some longer duration or higher intensity training. And that's where that 3-to-1 comes in really handy. 3-to-1 can come in also really handy after a workout if you need to really maximize glycogen or storage of carbohydrate, glycogen repletion very quickly, right? So that's where that 3-to-1 comes into play. 3-to-1 actually, if you haven't done the math, like you do the math on any product just by looking at grams of protein, grams of carbs, but 3-to-1 is traditionally chocolate milk, if you will. So that's like, if you can kind of start putting that into play. 4-to-1, I rarely, like, I don't think I ever have gone to 4-to-1. I think there's a lot of recovery powders and recovery drinks that are 4-to-1 base. Not many athletes actually need a 4-to-1. I think it's mostly just too high of a flood of carbohydrates for their system. It's not a bad thing, but depending on their health goals, their blood lipids, their body weight, body composition, a 4-to-1 could actually be a little bit more of a negative connotation for their progress. So back to this little hand model. I think I said this earlier, there's a little bit of wiggle room, right? I mean, the easiest example I give is if you're going to try to eat 1-to-1 for dinner and you have chicken and broccoli, well, get a piece of chicken that fills the size of your hand, get enough broccoli that that you can grab, and that's it. Like, that's literally the scope of this education. Now, of course, peanut butters or nut butters, yogurt, milk products. How do we measure those? Well, some of the things, obviously, you're not going to lather your hand with nut butter, right? So some things you do, there's, again, wiggle room. You have to look at the manufacturer's serving size. So if it's a half a cup or 3/4 cup, not they have to measure, but they just kind of have, and some athletes will measure once just so they know. But this, I cannot tell you, this works so beautifully. And let me just say this. I work with very, very type A athletes most of the time, because again, most of my clientele are endurance athletes. Very type A. I know what you know I'm talking about here. They want quantitative, they want to count, they want this, they want that. What I tell them, and I kind of bargain with them, I say, listen, for 2 weeks that you're going to work with me, for the first 2 weeks, let's just do this. Let's move away from the quantitative, it just embellish my qualitative hand model approach just for 2 weeks. And let's just see what happens, right? 9 times out of 10, they come back after 2 weeks. They're like, oh my gosh, that's the best thing ever. I couldn't figure out yogurt or peanut butter or whatever, but it's the best thing ever. I never want to count calories or grams again, right? And I do have, that 1 time out of 10 where athletes are like, yeah, that was fine, but I really would love to count and measure. And, I'm cool with that. Like, whatever, but the education is there because I need to get them. My goal is to get people away from the numbers first, so they recognize what hunger is again, what satiety is again, what eating a banana versus spinach does to their body, right? So I need them to be more intuitive. That's the intuitive eating approach. So hopefully I'm explaining this well enough so you can kind of grasp that concept. This literally is where I personally start every athlete's education session, every single one, right? I always start with my hand model, and then we maneuver it based on their ability to apply these things and their life stressors, their training cycle. But this is the go-to because it's so simple and it's so easy. So now I'm going to kind of focus and kind of turn the wheels, and we're going to go popping the hood, right? So I'm going to show you what a very simple model does in quantitative analysis or quantitative testing, that being metabolic efficiency testing. So let me show you these things. So metabolic efficiency testing, we're basically peeking inside the body to see how efficient the body is at using fat and using carbohydrates. So as I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, we have enormous amounts of fat storage in our body. We don't have that much carbohydrate stored in the body. We don't test protein because protein isn't stored as protein in the body. It's stored as amino acids. And it's a very low contribution in terms of exercise or energy expenditure during endurance activity. So we don't really need to worry about that, right? So what this testing does is it tells you how efficient you are in, like I said earlier, using fat and carbohydrate. Well, that is mostly due to the daily nutrition program. So most of the time, if an athlete eats very high carb, low protein, low fat, they're going to burn carbohydrates very early on, like at a slower pace, lower heart rate, which means they're burning through their carbohydrates very quickly and they're storing more fat. That's usually not the end goal for most endurance athletes. We usually want the opposite, right? It also allows us to structure a better nutrition plan. It's just like the blood work we were talking about earlier, like my experiment, my other athletes, like once we test first, then we can actually give them a daily nutrition plan based on my hand model, no counting, and we can see how robust the changes are in another 2 months or 3 months. And that's usually when I introduce pre and post testing, is about every 2 to 3 months, right? So let me explain very quickly, because I have a lot of people saying, okay, this is metabolic efficiency testing. Oh yeah, it's VO2. It's not VO2 max testing. In fact, VO2 max testing is a misnomer. There's no such thing as VO2 max. There is such a thing as VO2 peak. So briefly, VO2 peak and versus VO2 max, the brain will stop the body before it reaches maximal effort because it doesn't want to die, right? So in exercise physiology, we really don't use the word max anymore. We use peak. So what is VO2 peak testing? Well, it's about an 8 to 12 minute test that if done properly, you'll finish in 8 to 12 minutes. And it's a ramp test. Every minute you're getting faster or you're increasing the grade. You're looking basically for genetic potential. So you've always heard of what's your VO2 max, what's your ml per kg per minute or liters per minute. All that does is it's a comparison. You cannot, please hear me, endurance coaches, you cannot get training zones from an 8 to 12 minute exercise test. You cannot, especially since it's near maximal. You just do not have enough time to get it, because here's the thing, heart rate usually stabilizes in about 2 minutes, 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So by doing a ramp protocol every minute where you're increasing, you're not going to get good heart rate data. So please throw that test away, right? Lactate threshold testing, much better, right? This is a test that's usually about 30 to 60 minutes in duration, treadmill, bike, and it's taking blood. So it's looking at the buildup of lactate. It's really looking at lactate clearance and how efficient the body is at clearing lactate. That's the test. If you want training zones, performance training zones, heart rate, pace, whatever, that's the test you need to go to, right? So VO2 and lactate testing, they do not require fasting beforehand. Okay, remember that. Metabolic efficiency requires a 10 to 12 hour fast beforehand, as does resting metabolic rate. So a lot of people come up to me and say, oh yeah, I've had a metabolic efficiency test before. I was resting. I was sitting in a chair, laying down in a bed. I'm like, no. That's resting metabolic rate. The only thing you get from resting metabolic rate when done properly is how well your body is oxidizing carbohydrate and fat at rest, which is good. You're going to see some data on that in a second, but also what your calorie need is per day if you were just laying in bed all day long. So I'm sure you've heard of RMR, resting metabolic rate, before, but I used to do that back in the days. We used to measure RMR and then set calorie budgets. And it doesn't work. Like people, it just does not work. And trust me on this, it is so hard to count calories these days, and for accuracy, it's not worth it. Is it worth getting a resting metabolic rate test done? Absolutely. Part of a metabolic efficiency test. So I wanted to kind of give you an overview of VO2 peak testing, lactate threshold, and resting metabolic rate. Let me now focus on just metabolic efficiency testing, because that's kind of the meat and potatoes of where we're going with this, right? When I created this 16, 17 years ago, I wanted to create two scenarios. One was I wanted to find this metabolic efficiency point. That's the point at where fat and carbohydrate cross, if they cross. That's the point where they cross. That's called the metabolic efficiency point. That's basically where the body says, okay, I need more carbs because the intensity is getting too high for me now. And I need to really tap into my muscle glycogen stores, right? That's the incremental. Incremental means every 4 minutes, 4 minutes. Remember what I said about heart rate stability? That happens in 2 minutes. So the reason why I created this in 4-minute increments is because it allows for heart rate and gas exchange or substrate oxidation stability, right? So every 4 minutes, the speed is increasing if it's a running test. The power, the watts are increasing if it's a bike test. And I also created a walking test. So the speed doesn't change, but the incline changes. I actually use that quite a bit on my ultra runners when they do a lot of vertical. I've tested a couple people that have climbed Everest before. And same thing, I don't run them. I just give them a walking protocol where we get up to a pretty high incline. So that's the incremental. We're kind of searching for the metabolic efficiency point. The continuous test is basically, let's take a marathoner coming into us and saying, okay, I want to hit, my goal pace is an 8-minute pace. And I've been training for it. I'm about 4 to 6 weeks out of my race. I'm fit for an 8-minute pace. So we actually will put them on the treadmill at an 8-minute pace because that's their goal pace. That's what they told us. That's what their coach told us. And we will hold them there until we see stability in their carbohydrate and fat burning or oxidation. And then here's the beautiful part of this, and you'll see some of this on some slides here. The beauty of this is we can actually tell them how many calories they need per hour during the race or even during training based on their physiology, not research recommendations. And I think all of you know that a lot of research has not been done on female athletes, right? So we're kind of shooting in the dark. But when we do the testing, we get their exact calorie expenditure per hour. That's the bullet point under the main results that you see there. So huge breakthrough that we can actually measure this and provide that information to athletes. We can also look for what we call a sweet spot in their aerobic training zones. And I'll show you that here in a second. But let me jump into this and show you actually what we get from a metabolic efficiency test. So this is, again, I created this. This continues to evolve a little bit, but this is the resting data. So on the top left, you see the respiratory exchange ratio. That is basically looking at the association between the oxygen that they're consuming and the carbon dioxide that they're producing, right? So it's a basic exercise physiology term. When that is 0.85, that is interestingly where the body crosses from fat burning to carbohydrate burning. So in a resting data set, I actually like that RER number to be less than 0.8, because then I know from a health perspective, they're controlling their blood sugar, their risk for pre-diabetes or metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance is fairly low, okay? The next graph just to the right is the same data, but it breaks it up into a percentage of carbohydrate burning, which is the black graph, black bar, and then fat burning. So at rest, this athlete burns 35% of their energy from carbs and 65% from fat. That's what we want to see. We want to see more fat burning at rest. If not, there's something else going on in their body. Down below, the purple graph, that is their resting metabolic rate. So that's the calories per day that their body needs just to survive, like no walking around, no working, no training, no nothing. And then also we get the resting heart rate because we're monitoring all these things while they're resting. They're actually laying down in a very relaxed state with a mask on. So they're actually breathing all of their carbon dioxide and oxygen into a metabolic cart. So we're collecting that for 15 to 20 minutes. Then we get to the exercise test. And let me explain this really quick. The bottom table is their energy or their data table, right? So what you see on the bottom, the time is the 4-minute stages. And that's what I talked about earlier. So this test went 32 minutes. Every 4 minutes, this was a cycling test specifically, every 4 minutes, we increased the intensity by 20 watts in this particular athlete, right? We also recorded heart rates at the same time. So you'll see that in the next few slides. The top line graph indicates their percentage of carbohydrate, which is the black line, versus the percentage of fat, which is the red line, being burned at each stage. So at stage 1, when they were pedaling at 100 watts, their heart rate was 111. They were using 69% of their energy as fat, 31% as carbohydrate. Normally what we see from left to right, because intensity increases from left to right, this is where we see that star or that metabolic efficiency point. At some point, that body says, okay, I need more carbs now. For this particular athlete, it happened at a heart rate of 164 and a power output of 210 watts. So I'll show you some running examples here in a second also. But now we know this athlete is very efficient at using fat up until the heart rate of 164 and power output of 210. Now we can dig a little bit deeper here, because now we see how many calories that this athlete is burning per hour based on the intensity level, right? Why? I'll show you in the next slide. But the blue line, the blue graph, indicates the total calories being burned per hour if they were extrapolate that for an hour, and then where those calories are coming from. So again, black line or black bar is carbs, red bar is fat. So now we see not only how many calories they're burning, but where they're coming from. Why is this important? Well, the age-old question has always been, Coach, how many calories should I eat per hour during my marathon, during my 50K, during my 100 mile, during my Ironman, whatever? And as a sport dietitian, we've always had to rely on the research and say, well, 120 to 360 calories per hour. We don't know where you're at, but somewhere in the middle, somewhere low, somewhere high, we have no idea, right? Until now. So what I did, I did a whole bunch of data collection with athletes in the early 2000s. And I collected basically their dietary logs in terms of what they were eating and then how many calories they were burning. And I collected it mostly from cyclists, predominantly cyclists, because they trained with power meters and they actually gave me kilojoules that were burned. So basically calories that were burned. Heart rate monitors are fine, but they're a little bit off in their energy expenditure. Power meters are a little bit more accurate. So I was able to basically to correlate the amount of calories they were burning versus the amount of calories they consumed. And what I came up with after looking at hundreds and hundreds of data sets was there is what I call a total calorie intake efficiency ratio, 10 to 30%. What does that mean? That means most runners, well, most endurance athletes in general, like cyclists can eat a little bit more, but most endurance and athletes in general should consume 10 to 30% of the calories that they burn per hour. Okay, so move to that first data point. See that 34 to 102 calories? Let me back up really quickly. Remember 34 to 102. Whoops. Okay, see that first data point, 341 calories burned in that first stage? 10% of that is 34. 30% of that is, 102. So all I'm doing is we're seeing how many calories that athlete burns per hour. Now we're taking a percentage of that. Why is it 10 to 30%? Because that is a gut digestive issue, right? Especially runners, as we all know, runners cannot eat a lot unless you're an ultra runner, you're going a little bit slower, right? Doing some walking and running, right? Usually runners can't put a lot in their stomach. So we have to err on the side of lower. So the 34 calories per hour, right? That's so this is kind of assuming that digestively there's a point, right, where if you eat too much, you're going to get some serious GI distress. And that's where the 10 to 30% comes into play. 9.8 times out of 10, I've never had an athlete come to me with digestive GI distress when they've actually had this data, because they're not over consuming. That's the big thing. So for this athlete, based on the intensity at which they're training, I could actually prescribe to them, just based on their physiology, the exact range of calories that they need per hour during that bike race, during that Ironman, during the marathon, whatever, all from a metabolic efficiency test. So it really makes nutrient timing so much easier. It's just amazingly night and day, because now we don't have to look at research that's usually done on young males. We can actually look at that person, kind of popping the hood and looking at them individually. The last piece of data is looking at that sweet spot exercise training. So for the coaches out there, this isn't lactate threshold performance zones. This is basically saying that anywhere under this athlete's metabolic efficiency point, they are burning more fat, as you can see from the line, like duh, right? So you've got now some wiggle room in your exercise prescription to say, all right, if I want Sally to be burning more fat, I should look at the highest percentage of fat being burned and at what intensity and what heart rate is that being done. And maybe I focus more, maybe if it's base training, right? Maybe I focus 2 or 3 sessions at that intensity level, knowing that they're going to be burning more fat there. Again, if that's a goal to improve metabolic efficiency and improving health and body composition, all that stuff. So you can actually use this data as a coach and say, got it. And that's actually what I provide coaches when I test their athletes. I give them that sweet spot and say, this is where your athlete wants to, when it is aerobic, kind of fat burning, if you will, training, this is where they want to stay. So I don't know. I always get excited about this, and it's, I'm going on 17 years of doing this now, and I still get excited, but there's so much great data that you can utilize from this and actually monitor the athlete. So let me get into the whole monitoring piece, because I don't have a very profound software platform like Inside Tracker, right? But let me show you some pre and post that will hopefully, I don't want to say blow your mind, but you'll definitely be more of a believer here, right? So this was a late 40-year-old female recreational runner and kind of fitness enthusiast, if you will. Tested her. This was test 1. So what you see here is actually what happens in about 30 to 40% of endurance athletes that I personally test. They do not have that metabolic efficiency because their nutrition plan is so heavy on the carbs and so low in protein and fat, their body continually burns through carbohydrate. Now, is that a bad thing? It could be, right? Absolutely. Number one, we don't have a lot of stores of carbs. So if we're constantly burning through them, we're creating this energy deficit eventually, right? If you can imagine this gal trying to run a marathon, she would bonk, or she would need carbohydrates coming in probably every 20 to 30 minutes. And sometimes that's just not comfortable, especially during a marathon, right? So she was extremely what we call inefficient. She was burning more carbs, burning a lot less fat. So I got my hands on her a little bit. We created a different daily nutrition plan based on this data because we found out where she's starting, created a nutrition plan based on my hand model, the carbohydrate to protein ratio. And then what happened 2 months later? Well, this is huge because now we started in that first data set, or that first stage, she started burning fat now. If you recall from the previous one, she wasn't at all, she wasn't even close. She was 43% fat burning now versus 56, but she actually had a metabolic efficiency point now, which happened at a 10:30 pace and 137 beats per minute heart rate. So this was huge for her. And this only happened in 8 weeks, right? 8 weeks. And if I recall with her, we were not too aggressive. Like we did more of that 2-to-1, maybe even 2.5-to-1, because she just wasn't ready for like that 1-to-1. Because like I said earlier, it's kind of difficult at times. Okay. Now, this is pretty cool. This was a 48-year-old male triathlete that I tested a couple of years ago. The left, this was a bike test. So on the left was his bike test 1, and on the right was bike test 2, and that was 2 months after, right? So 8 weeks again, give or take. So what we see, bike test 1, his metabolic efficiency point happened at 110 beats per minute, 125 watts. 2 months later, 126 beats per minute and 145 watts. What does that mean for performance? Again, does it mean he's going to go faster? Well, yeah, if his coach is giving him good sets to do and good training, of course. But what this is allowing metabolically is for him to conserve his carbohydrates better for the long haul. So they're there when he really needs them, but it's also allowing him to burn more fat at higher intensity, which is huge. A lot of people say it's not possible. It's absolutely possible, right? You're seeing it, right now, if you haven't seen this type of data before. Now, I also did a run test on him, right? So run test number 1, which was in September 2019, his metabolic efficiency point happened at 144 beats per minute, 8-minute pace. And then 2 months later, he whittled that down to a 725 pace. So again, he's teaching his body to burn more fat at higher intensities. He actually ran a December marathon and PR that he got, I think it was just under 3-hour mark, like 258, 259, somewhere around there. So, which totally PR'd for him. So it goes to show you, like you can teach the body to use more fat as energy, which means you're preserving carbohydrates, which, yes, it can lead to a higher performance. Absolutely. Now, one more, I wanted to end with this one. This was an early 60-year-old male. He was a recreational exerciser. So you wouldn't call him an endurance athlete. You would call him a fitness enthusiast. So he weightlifted. He did some mountain biking, right? Did some walks with his wife and stuff. So kind of your I guess your kind of normal person that just cares about fitness. So this was him test 1. So man, remember again, black line, carbohydrate, red line, fat. Here was test 2, 9 weeks later. Wait a second, Bob. Didn't you just show us like some pretty profound effects in those previous slides? I did. I'm also showing you, let me go back to his first test. There's his first test. There's a second test. Not a lot of change, is there? If you don't implement a different daily nutrition plan, you don't see physiological metabolic changes. This proves it. This absolutely proves it. So with him, he just was very resistant, even though I set out a plan that was not aggressive, because I always ask athletes, how aggressive do you want to be? He's like, no, I don't want to do that at all. He wasn't willing to make even the smallest changes. And thus he didn't see the robust changes that we saw on the previous slide. So there are these athletes that even though you give them a plan, sometimes they don't implement it. Sometimes they need a little bit more help. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of metabolic efficiency, kind of part 2 with not only the nutrition implementation strategy, that the primary one I use, which is the hand model, the carbohydrate to protein ratio, but also showing you what physiological really biomarker test can do once we do kind of peek into the body from a substrate oxidation standpoint, not from a blood standpoint, but more from a breath by breath and measuring the substrates, specifically the carbohydrate and fat burning. So hopefully, that was quick. That's a lot of information. I did want to kind of take a deep breath, because ton of data. You're probably like, if you haven't seen this before, you're probably like, what the heck just happened to me? I think you'll get it, especially if you rewatch this a couple of times, you'll be like, oh, okay, now I got this. Now I see what he's talking about. But I did want to respect your time. I did want to end with a couple of things, because I've been talking a lot about metabolic efficiency training. I actually created a metabolic efficiency training specialist certification. I actually created this 9 or 10 years ago now. And I take health professionals, which includes coaches, fitness, dietitians, even medical doctors. I take them through a 2-month training or a certification program. And you can see month 1, there are 6 modules. It's all online. And then month 2 is actually a specialized mentorship program with me. So if you're interested in this, or just even learning more about metabolic efficiency, I do have a devoted website for metabolic efficiency training, so you can learn more about that. And then, of course, as Roy mentioned earlier, I did pioneer both of these concepts, both the metabolic efficiency and the nutrition periodization, and I did write the first ever books on the topic. So you can find those. I think they're on Amazon, but sometimes Amazon isn't great with those. But you can just find those on my website also. So, with that, I know I'm not on time, but I finished as quickly as I could.
Oh, it was awesome and worth the extra. I believe we're 8 minutes over the scheduled time, but worth every minute. Thank you. That was incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. Perfect.
And detailed, which I think is appropriate given the topic. So I figured that there were 2 questions.
Okay.
So if we want to take another couple of minutes to answer them, so we're here, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah.
So one of the questions was from Michael, and Michael is asking if this would be good for non-athletes as well, someone who's active but does no endurance or race training. And this question came in when you were on the slide about the hand model.
Yeah. Michael, great question. And I would say it might even be, dare I say, more important for that population, because maybe, exercise or endurance training isn't part of their life, maybe just some daily walks, which is great. But so nutrition and metabolic efficiency training has a more robust effect than exercise does in teaching the body to utilize more fat as energy. So absolutely, hands down, metabolic efficiency training should actually be used in every population, minus kids, because kids are still growing, they're still developing. But it doesn't matter if they're a fitness enthusiast, couch to 5K or just, an Olympic athlete. Metabolic efficiency, especially with the hand model, can and should, in my professional and personal opinion, be used on everybody and anybody. Because remember, it's all about how we best regulate blood sugar. Blood sugar is correlated with health health concerns, but also exercise performance concerns too.
Thanks, Bob.
Yep.
So one more question, and this one is from Fiona, and she is asking, if your off season is a couple of months, is it realistic to do the 1-to-1 ratio, and how many months is realistic?
That's a great question. It kind of depends on your personality, Fiona. It's absolutely realistic. Like it's realistic for 4 weeks. Like I usually give about 4 to 5 weeks as the tipping point of making sure a behavior starts to stick in the body. So I say if you have a minimum of 4 weeks, absolutely you could try the 1-to-1 ratio. Just remember, it's a little more, I don't want to say restrictive, but when an endurance athlete specifically, and I'm assuming we're talking about an endurance athlete here, when they drop their carbohydrates too much too soon, sometimes they get a little bit cranky, right? And that's why we want more time to develop it. So sometimes I'll do what I call carbohydrate unloading. So we've heard of carbohydrate loading. I'll unload them for like 4 weeks before, like after their first or after the last competition. I'll start unloading the first month of off season. So we kind of every week we get lower in carbs, low in carbs, low in carbs. And then at week 4, we're kind of at that 1-to-1 ratio. So now we've kind of taken a stepwise approach. So they're not getting as cranky. Now I've had some athletes being able to, on the drop of a dime, flip of a light switch, go from competition eating, which is sometimes a little higher carbohydrates, all the way to like a 1-to-1 immediately. Like it really depends on the personality. Functionally and metabolically and biologically, the biological system, the organism, we can do that immediately. Psychologically, it takes a little more time. So that's the only hiccup in that process is the thing between your shoulders here.
Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
All right, so let's wrap it up here. This was really detailed and valuable for me, and I'm sure those who attended. So Bob, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Diving into these topics in more detail. Hopefully everyone that was here learned hopefully a few things today. I know I did. And like I said, it was recorded. So we are going to share the recording after today. You'll get that shortly. And so you can rewatch, and I'm sure that would help given the amount of data that Bob presented today. I know
Yes.
I'll probably go back and rewatch it myself. So Bob, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here, and we will see you again soon.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
Have a wonderful evening.